Does anyone know?
Why don't you talk about the value of family and also value of genealogy?
Okay, I'll do that. The value of family and the value of genealogy. Family is extraordinarily important for Muslims. They don't have a view of eternal marriage or anything like that, but they do see the family as being crucially important. And they've been doing genealogy since before Islam. There are whole huge collections of books of genealogy, and they trace their origins back to Abraham, and before him to Adam. And the Arabs see themselves, just as the Bible sees them, as growing out of the seed of Abraham and so on, being the heirs of Abraham and of Ishmael. So that is very, very important to them. And even in traditional times, Arabic names were genealogies. Someone would be called Abu Yusuf, Muhammad, Ibn something or other, and that would say, father of Joseph, Muhammad, son of so-and-so. The term Ibn means son of. The term Bint means daughter of. And so these long names would often be, in effect, 4 or 5 generation genealogies. And then it might say Al-Baghdadi, the one from Baghdad, or Al-Damashqi, the one from Damascus, or Al-Qudsi, the one from Jerusalem. Al-Halabi, the one from Aleppo. So it would say something about them, or something about the profession, or the career, or the way that people made a living. I'm sure this is true in Swedish. I'm thinking in English of names like their family names. We don't even think about what they mean anymore, but there are lots and lots of people named farmer, and carpenter, and cooper, someone who makes a barrel, and what else do we have? Smith. Somebody who once worked in a blacksmith shop, or Ford, somebody who probably ran a ferry on a river or something like that. Just Fisher. I mean, something about the history of the family just from the name if you think about it. And quite often, Arabic names will have that element too. They'll have multiple generations. They'll have something about where they're from, something about what someone in the line did for a living. Might have been a wool's maker, or a tent maker, or a khayyam, a tent maker. Things like that. So, any questions? Yes? Yeah.
Well, I have 2 questions. My first is, if you talk about jihad as a defensive movement of war, can anyone say that, okay, we're fighting jihad against these people? Or, is that up to anyone, or can it come from a specific person?
That's a good question. I'll repeat it. The question is, when we talk about jihad as a defensive war, or any kind of war really, who can declare a war, jihad? Typically, the so-called ulama, the religious learned class of Islam, have said, look, we have to do this because we know the law. You need to get our approval on this. Saddam Hussein, for example, the first Gulf War, wanted to have that declared a jihad. And the ulama, to their considerable credit, would not do it. Now, under Saddam, that was a very dangerous thing. They said, no, it does not fit. We can't do it. Now, on the other hand, there are movements like the Islamic State that have simply said, look, we declare it a jihad. Osama bin Laden and his people said, this is a jihad. Now, other people in the Islamic world said, no, it's not. It doesn't fit the rules. But because there is no single church, well, people can say what they want if they can persuade others to follow along with them. But there are rules for this. And actually, the law of Islam on jihad is fairly clear. There are contradictions, different views. But I think a lot of what's fought under the name of jihad today does not fit the criteria. It just doesn't. But again, I said this earlier in another context, if you get a good lawyer can make the law say almost anything he wants it to say, if he's clever enough. You can find precedents and principles that will allow what you want to do. So that's the danger with no central authority. I've said before, if there were a group of Mormons out there blowing things up or something in the name of Mormonism, the church would issue a statement within about 12 seconds saying, they're not Mormons, we cut them off, they have nothing to do with us. But there's no organization in Islam that has the capacity to do that. You can have Islamic leaders speak out, and many have, saying, this is not us, They have nothing to do with this. But it's not like it's an official organization. There's a hand right behind you.
Yeah. What is the church position on Muhammad as a prophet?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Thank you for asking. The question is, what is the church's position on Muhammad? Okay, I said already that there were some statements in the 19th century from Joseph Smith, starting with him, and also very clearly from George A. Smith and Parley Pratt in the 5th volume of the Journal of Discourses, in which they pay tribute to Muhammad as having received inspiration from God, which by the standards of the 19th century was really radical. I mean, there was nobody else saying that. The usual person who's pointed to in the West as being the first to really say something positive about Muhammad was, what's his name? Scott's intellectual, not Macaulay. My mind's suddenly gone blank. Anyway, he writes a book called Heroes and Hero Worship in History. And he has a chapter on Muhammad, which is very positive about Muhammad. But he publishes that. He's the great progressive intellectual in certainly the English-speaking world at that time. The first person to say something really positive about Muhammad, and he beats those Mormon apostles out on the American frontier by about 3 years. Now, they've probably never heard of him. So they're amazingly open at that time. Now, what has the church had to say since then? The most important statement is one that was issued in 1976 by President Kimball and his 2 counselors, which is, you can look it up online. It's a statement about the church's attitude toward other religions. And it pays tribute to, among others, Muhammad as having received a portion of God's light, by which he brought truths to his people. That, again, is a very positive statement. It's remarkable because you don't get that kind of thing from very many Christian churches. And you certainly don't get it from churches that tend to take a very conservative view of Scripture, as Latter-day Saints do. And so we're sort of surprising in that regard. The church has had positive things to say about Muhammad. It has published positive articles in the Ensign. I don't know if they've appeared in Leona. They're all some years ago. One by Howard W. Hunter, and a couple of others, at least 3 others that I can think of, that were amazingly positive. So the church has had positive things to say about Islam and about Muhammad. And I can tell you from personal conversations with most of the current leadership of the church, the 12 in the First Presidency, that they're very comfortable with that. I was invited, I'll just mention this briefly, I was invited a number of years ago when President Hinckley was still president of the church, so it's been a while. But I was invited with 2 others to come up and speak to some of the general authorities on Islam. And it was a group called the Area Committee. I knew that there'd be several members of the 12 there. And then I was given a call a few days before, and they said, well, all of the 12 have decided to come. And then I got a call 2 nights before, and they said, well, the First Presidency would like to be there. And so I went in, and I remember coming in, and there was a set of 15 chairs in a semicircle, and a chair for us. And President Monson, who was then the first counselor, came in, and he said, whoa, he said, this looks like some sort of Senate committee hearing. You're in trouble. And Elder Eyring walked in and said, are you nervous? And I said, well, I've had more relaxing days. And he said, yeah, he said, been there, done that. But it was a very, very positive meeting. They were very interested. And I had never heard a negative thing from any of them about Islam as such or about Muhammad. Never. They are really trying to reach out in positive ways. I mean, does that mean that they're not concerned about some issues? No, anybody who pays attention would be concerned about certain things. But they want to send a message of friendship. It's really important to them to send a message of friendship to the Islamic world. In fact, I'll mention this, I was involved for many years with a project at BYU called the Islamic Translation Series. And when I first tried to start it, that was kind of the initiative of the Brethren. I mean, I had this specific idea, but I was talking with a member of the 70, and then talking with members of the 12, and then they asked me to do it, to launch this series, because they wanted to send a message of respect and friendship to the Islamic world. and they have supported that, backed that project for years. And I know when Elder Holland goes to the Middle East, he often carries a bunch of the books published by this series to give out to people as gifts and so on. This is very different. And let me say a couple of other things. Some stories that I'm fond of. You remember the tsunami, the huge wave that hit the Indian Ocean, what was it? I don't remember the year. 2004? Something like that. Well, the church was involved in a big way with aid there, particularly in Indonesia. And we showed up early. People asked, we asked the Indonesians, well, what do you need? And they said, well, unfortunately, what we need is body bags for the bodies. So the church grabbed as many thousands of those as they could get and shipped them off. But then they also said, the church said, we will be here for the long term. There will be other aid organizations that come in, but they'll probably leave. We won't. We'll stay here until we've done what needs to be done. Now, to the credit of the church, there were some organizations, I won't name them, but there were some organizations that came to Indonesia and said, look, we have food for you, but you must listen to our preaching first. The church never did that. The church brought in food and said, do you need it? Are you hungry? Here it is. But here's the one that really makes me proud. At the end, when the church had rebuilt some schools there, they outfitted them with computers for girls' schools and so on. They were probably a little bit better than they'd been before. The church then said, what do you need now? What else can we do for you? And the people out in this particular Aceh province of Indonesia said, well, we're spiritually at a loss. The copies of the Quran that we had here were all destroyed in the wave, in the tsunami. Many of them swept out to sea. People don't have copies of the Holy Book of Islam. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, bought thousands of copies of the Quran and distributed them in that province of Indonesia. Now, I'm extremely proud of that. I think that was a wonderful gesture. Do we make a secret of the fact that we really like them to be Latter-day Saints? No. But we're not going to say, you must become Latter-day Saints or we won't help you. And that was a real token of respect to them, to say, we will give you copies of your holy book. If that's what you need, we'll give it to you. And so, I think that sends a very loud message right there. So, any other questions or objections? Or yes?
About the Sunni and Shia conflict.
Yes, that's important. That needs to be mentioned. The Sunni and Shia conflict. When the Prophet Muhammad died, he died after an illness of about 5 days in length. People didn't expect him to die. And it put the community into a real crisis, because Muhammad was Islam. He had been the founding prophet. Islam existed because of him. And so what were they going to do when he was gone? I think you can imagine a little bit what it was like when Joseph Smith was suddenly killed. And there had been no Mormon church before. Suddenly, the man who called it into existence, the man who led it, the indispensable man, the man that they could not do without, was gone. Right? And even people like Brigham Young, for at least a few moments, didn't know what to do. You may have read the account of Brigham riding along and saying, but what happened to the keys? And then suddenly he realizes, and he slaps his leg and says, they're right here. Because Joseph had been trying to prepare them for this. He'd given them the keys. It's like the apostles in the New Testament. Jesus keeps telling them he's going to die. They don't really believe it. And when it happens, they're shocked. They can't imagine the world without him. Okay, so the Muslims lose Muhammad, and they're lost. And there's a really wonderful story, by the way. Muhammad's body is still unburied. He's lying in a house where he's just died. And there's a man by the name of Omar. Omar will become the second caliph, the second successor to Muhammad. But Omar is a fairly young man, and he's a passionate man. He has a temper, and he's kind of emotional. And he is out there trying to convince the Muslims that Muhammad is not really dead. He just seems to be dead. His spirit has ascended into the heavens, because there is the story that he had done that earlier, right? There's an older man by the name of Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr will become the first successor to Muhammad. He's older than Omar. He walks along, he watches Omar speak, and Omar is becoming more and more emotional, assuring people Muhammad is not really dead. He's not really dead. He cannot be dead. So Abu Bakr listens to this for a while, then walks into the house. He checks Muhammad and says, he's dead. You can tell, he's really dead. So he comes walking back out, and he puts his arm around Omar's shoulders. And he says, Omar, be still, calm down. And then he speaks to the audience, and this is the line that I love. He says to the audience, for those of you who worship Muhammad, Muhammad is dead. For those of you who worship God, God lives. That's a great line. Well, almost immediately a group of Muslims say, look, we've got to choose a successor because by the time Muhammad is dead, the Muslims control almost the entire Arabian Peninsula. For the first time in the history of Arabia, there's a kind of state. It's always been Bedouin nomads up till then, no government. But Muhammad has now founded an Islamic state. Not the Islamic state, but an Islamic state. And so someone has to succeed him. And so almost everybody comes to Abu Bakr and offers him what's called the bay'ah. The bay'ah is a profession of allegiance. They shake his hand and pledge allegiance to him. He becomes the leader of the community, the first of the 4 Orthodox caliphs. And the Sunni Muslims believe that that is the proper line. That's the way it should happen. The Shiites believe that he was the wrong choice. There was another man by the name of Ali. Ali was much younger. Ali was the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, and an early warrior in the wars that they had and so on, a heroic figure. They said, no, it should have been him. The succession, the leadership belongs to the family of the Prophet. It should go down the line of the Prophet. Now, does that sound familiar to you? It's like the break between the LDS and the RLDS, the Reorganized Church. And so this dispute already begins there. Initially, it's just an argument about politics, who should have succeeded. And so they come to be called the Shia Ali, the faction of Ali. Hence today the Shia, or the Shiites. And then the two communities somewhat split apart theologically over the years. But the main issue was who should succeed the Prophet. And so the Islamic world is divided today into the 2 main groups. The Sunnis, who are the majority, and the Shia, who are the minority. Probably about 10% of the world's population, the Muslim population, are Shia. But in the heartland of Islam, between Egypt and Iran, it's almost 50-50. Iran is just about entirely Shia. Iraq is about 70% Shia. Southern Lebanon is Shia. Yemen has a large Shiite population. And of course, the leadership of Syria is a Shiite majority, or minority there too. So, but the main dispute is over who should have succeeded the Prophet. And the major faction of the Shiites are what are called Ithna Shari'a, or 12 Shiites. And they believe that there are 12 imams. The 12th one disappears as a child. They're expecting him to return. Sort of a messianic idea. The Sunnis say it doesn't much matter who rules as long as someone does, and keeps order and enforces the law and avoids civil war. So that's the origin of the Sunni Shiite split. And some people ask me sometimes, well, which is more radical? That's impossible to answer. Both sides have moderates, both sides have radicals. Iran has been fairly radical, but ISIS, and Iran is Shiite, but ISIS is Sunni and hates the Shiites. So you can have radicals on both sides, but you also have moderates on both sides. It really is impossible to say. Yeah, the question is, do Muslims believe in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And the word that's used in Arabic is Injil, which is probably a corruption of the Greek word evangelion, or evangel, so gospel, good news. And I would say, no, they really don't believe in those 4 Gospels. They believe in something called the Injil, which is a book that, as the Quran expresses it, was given to Jesus. But the 4 Gospels we have today are not that book. They're corruptions. Their attitude toward the Bible would be something like the Latter-day Saint attitude toward the Apocrypha. The Doctrine and Covenants records God's answer to Joseph Smith. Should I translate the Apocrypha? The answer he's given is there are some truths in it and some falsehoods mixed together. You don't need to translate it. Muslims will say they venerate the Injil, but in practice, very few Muslims have read the New Testament Gospels because they don't see those as the Injil. They're a product of an apostate Christian church. They contain truth, but it's mixed with error. So the Muslims believe in the Torah, which is the Torah, the Injil, the Gospel, the Zabur, the Psalms. But they see them as books that were given to prophets, the way the Quran was given to Muhammad. So there was a hand up here.
I had an expression.
Oh, sorry, there was a
I had
second.
two.
Yeah, that's right.
My next is, Surah chapter 9. It talks about, I wonder when, where, not to kill, because it talks about paradise when yourself is dead and you're killing others as well on the same time. So I don't figure that out, if you could give me guidelines there.
Yeah, this is a question about Surah 9, particularly the idea of killing and going to paradise.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised this because it was something I did want to talk about. Obviously, it's on people's minds. There are a number of passages in the Quran that are cited, particularly by critics of Islam, to point to Islam as a very violent religion, because you can certainly select passages that say, kill the unbelievers wherever you find them, and so on and so forth. To me, context is everything. And what needs to be understood in these cases is these are revelations given to Muhammad, if you read the historical background of them, during a time when the Islamic community is at war. The Muslims have been driven out of Mecca into the city of Medina. And now they're at war with the people who've stolen their property and driven them out and have sought to kill them. So this is an order given in a time of war. And I don't think it's talking about all unbelievers. I think it's talking about those specific unbelievers living in Mecca who had done this to the Muslims. And the example I've given sometimes to an audience, sorry it's an American example, but I think it'll make sense to you, is I've said, look, if you were to find a letter from Dwight Eisenhower in which he said, bomb Munich and Berlin and Stuttgart, destroy every factory, kill the Germans. It would be one thing if this is General Dwight Eisenhower in 1944 giving an order, because there's a war going on. Well, war is ugly, but that's what happens. You bomb factories and you attack cities and so on. It would be a very different thing if this were President Dwight Eisenhower in 1954, when the United States is at peace with Germany, and he suddenly issues an order, go kill Germans and blow up Stuttgart, Munich, and Berlin. Then you'd think, he's a criminal lunatic. He's insane. What's he doing? So if you understand that these commands to fight the infidels, the unbelievers, to ambush them, to fight them, that they're military commands given during a war that's already happening. That's different than seeing them as general rules for dealing with all non-Muslims. Now, ISIS and some of the radical groups see them as general rules for all time. I would argue they're not, and that they're misinterpreting them. That that's a misapplication of those rules. It would be like taking the commands to kill the Canaanites and saying, wow, all the world is Canaanites, Jews should always be killing all non-Jews. That would be insane. And so I think that's the way that needs to be understood. But I'm sort of amused by the fact that both the radical Muslim extremists and some of their critics interpret the Quran the same way. And I think they're wrong. So, and there was a hand over here. Yeah.
You were talking about they don't have an organization and they don't have a leadership. But what about the fatwa? I understand that it's not just any Muslim can pronounce a fatwa.
Right. Yeah, the question is about a fatwa. What is a fatwa? Well, often we tend to assume that a fatwa is a death sentence. The famous case is the novelist Salman Rushdie, who wrote a novel that made fun of the Prophet Muhammad and of his wives. And so the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa calling for his death, basically saying to any Muslim, you can kill Salman Rushdie for having written this novel. Now, I myself think it was a terrible novel, but I just prefer negative book reviews. If you had to kill every novelist who's written a bad book, there'd be a lot of novelists. But a fatwa is not a death sentence. Here's what a fatwa is. A person who is legally qualified, who's called a mufti, can issue a fatwa, which is an advisory legal opinion. Okay, now he had a lot of prestige because of who he was. But there are large numbers of muftis, and most of the questions they get are questions about, well, you know, my son is a drunk. Do I have to leave my money to him? And you go to a mufti and he gives you an advisory opinion based on Islamic law saying, no, you don't. If he's unworthy, if he will misuse the money, you don't have to, under the rules of Islam, leave your money to him. Or I have a question about property in a marriage. You go to a mufti. Or you're having an issue with someone in business. You go to the mufti and the mufti gives you an advisory opinion. That's all a fatwa is. It's not a death sentence. Usually it's on a very small issue, something to do with family property or marriage relations or something like that. And it doesn't have the force of law. It's just an advisory opinion. Now often people will go to the mufti and they'll say, we promise as part of our condition of going to you that we will abide by, we will follow whatever decision you make. But that's not the state telling them to do that. That's their agreement with him. He says, okay, if you promise that you will obey and do what I say, then I will research this question, I'll think about it, and I'll write out my opinion, and you follow it. It's like arbitration, at least in the US system. And so not anybody can do that, but again, it's not an organization. It's a person who has the particular status, he has the training. It's like setting yourself up in a way as a particular kind of lawyer or attorney, I think, where someone might come to you and say, what about this? What about my will? You know, how can I set this up? And he knows the law and he gives you an advice on how you should do it. So, but it's not now this is not pure. I mean, in some areas, the mufti has a state appointment. In some areas, he doesn't. I've met the Grand Mufti of Malaysia. He had a state position. I've met the Grand Mufti of Australia. He did not. It depends on the system that they're in. I'll tell you the story really quickly about the Grand Mufti of Malaysia. I didn't know who this man was. I was giving a lecture in Kuala Lumpur at an Institute for Islamic Studies there. And there was this man on the front row who was dressed in the outfit of a clergyman, and he looked really unhappy through my whole talk. And I thought, this is not going over well. He's not enjoying this. And then when I opened up for questions, he was the first one to ask a question. I thought, oh no, this is going to be terrible. Well, first of all, he spoke extraordinarily good English. And he turned out to be very, very friendly. And he also turned out to be the Grand Mufti of Malaysia. I was talking about the importance of Christian-Muslim dialogue, and he was all for it. Very friendly, very nice person. So I made a mental note, okay, don't judge people by appearance. You know this, and you keep doing it. But he would have been the one who would give opinions like that in the supreme legal authority in Malaysia. And I'm convinced, just by the way he spoke, he started off by quoting British authors like Charles Dickens and all this, and I thought, okay, this would be a very good man to go to with a legal dispute. He's very bright, he's very humane, very friendly. There are others who would not be, but you know, it varies from place to place. Yes?
In the Book of Mormon, the Nephites are repeatedly being warned of the Lamanites. I sometimes think, is there anything in the Bible warning Christians about the descendants of Ishmael?
The Book of Mormon is constantly warning the Nephites against the Lamanites. They should beware of the Lamanites. Is there anything in the Bible that warns Christians to be wary of the descendants of Ishmael? Honestly, I can't think of anything. No, I can't. Maybe somebody else can think of something, but I can't. there's always the warning to beware of evil, wherever it might come from, but that could come from anybody, including fellow Christians, sometimes. So no, I don't think there's anything that really does that. So, yes.
Their attitude regarding alcohol.
The attitude of Muslims regarding alcohol, yeah. Sometimes I hear Mormons sometimes say, oh, we're practically the same as Muslims. They don't drink and we don't drink. Yeah, that's a very small thing. There are some differences beyond that. But yes, good Muslims won't drink wine. Now, sometimes they will disagree about what wine means, what the word khamr means in the Quran. So some will say, well, it's grape wine, but you can drink date wine, or there are other kinds of fermented drink that you can drink. I mean, you have all sorts of interpretations. And it surprised me once I was out to lunch or to dinner with the head of the theology faculty at Mohammed V University in Rabat, Morocco. So we sit down and he orders a bottle of wine. And I was a little bit surprised. And he started to pour me a glass. And I said, no, I don't drink. And he said, yeah. He said, I don't either. So I explained, no, I'm really serious. I actually don't. But that was really surprising to me. Going out to dinner with the head of the religious education department at BYU and having him pour a bottle of wine, I was really surprised. But good Muslims don't drink alcoholic beverages. They don't eat pork. And so, there are many Muslims that obey those rules. There are also what I call Jack Muslims. Muslims who are Muslim in name, but they don't really obey the rules. But yes.
I wonder what does the Quran says about how men should treat their wives.
Now, what does the Quran say about how men should treat their wives? It has a fair amount to say about that topic. Women are given the right of inheritance, for example, in the Quran. This was probably revolutionary at the time of Muhammad, because women in pre-Islamic Arabia were treated like property. They could be inherited, passed around. So the Quran grants women the right to divorce. It gives them the right to inherit. Now, they're given a smaller inheritance than men. But there's a reason for that, actually, because under the Arabian system, the man was responsible with whatever money he had to support the wife. The wife was not under obligation to support the man. That was her money. So she got a smaller amount. It makes a certain amount of sense. Some people have said to me that, the Quran even denies that women have souls. That's just nonsense. The Quran talks about mu'mineen wa mu'minat, believers and believeresses, if you will. I mean, they're treated equally in that regard. And will there be women in paradise? Yes. The Quran explicitly, many times, talks about male believers and female believers being in paradise. But there are some other areas that are a little bit difficult. There is one passage particularly where a man is told that he can strike his wife if she's not a good wife. Now, scholars and the lawyers have argued about this one for a long time. It's heating up again. Because what does it mean to strike the wife? Does it mean to hit her hard? No. Almost all the lawyers agree, no. You should never hit her hard. But then some say, well, is it even good to hit her at all? What does that mean? Well, that's an interesting point of discussion. But it is a problem passage in the Quran for a lot of modern people and modern Muslims. What does it mean to allow a man to hit his wife? Some say, well, you can strike her, but not enough that it would make any mark. Well, that's still not good. So there are areas of equality and some areas of inequality. Women are told to dress modestly, for example. They're not specifically told how to dress. It doesn't say that they have to cover their faces except for their eyes or anything like that. That's custom. That's grown up in the years since the Quran. So it's a mixed thing. On the other hand, does the Quran say that women can't drive as they can't drive in Saudi Arabia? No, it never says that. And so in some countries, women are allowed to do almost anything. In Egypt, many of the doctors are women. They can hold any office, hold any profession. On the other hand, in Afghanistan under the Taliban, women could do essentially nothing. I mean, there are wide varieties of interpretation. I'll give you an example. Iran, at one point, denounced Afghanistan under the Taliban as being oppressive to women. Now that tells you how bad things were in Afghanistan, because Iran isn't normally thought of as a feminist utopia. But what happened was that the leadership of Iran basically said, look, anything that is not forbidden to women in the Quran and in the traditions is permitted to women. So that opens up a lot of things, because the Quran doesn't say a lot of things about what women can and can't do. The Taliban interpreted as saying anything the Quran and the traditions don't expressly allow to women, women are forbidden to do. Well, that meant there was almost nothing they could do, because the Quran says so little about that. So it really depends on, it's this fork in the road, you know. If you make the one wrong decision or a different decision, you go very different directions. And so, the Quran, the real danger to women, it seems to me, in the Islamic world is not so much from the Quran, it's from the so-called hadith, the traditions that grew up after the Quran, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Many, almost all of which claim to go back to Muhammad, but I actually think that most of them probably don't. It's what the community decided to do in the 3 centuries after the Prophet Muhammad. You see, go ahead.
Yeah, why don't you tell us about how Muhammad treated everybody that was not Muslims?
Yeah. There's a request that I tell some stories about how Muhammad treated people who are not Muslims. Again, it's a complex story. There's some rough stories, but by and large, his treatment of non-Muslims was very positive. Prophet Muhammad he lived in a minority Muslim Arabia. And so he made peace treaties with Jewish tribes, with Christians. They were given protected status and so on. He was not oppressive. He wasn't trying to exterminate them, which is what ISIS is trying to do now. My favorite story probably comes not from Muhammad, but from Omar. You know the story that I'm going to tell. I take tours sometimes to Israel, and I like to point out a spot in Jerusalem where something really, really important happened. When the Muslims conquered Jerusalem in the early 640s AD, the Caliph Omar, the man that I've already mentioned, came to Jerusalem. And while he was there taking a tour of the city, he was given a tour of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I don't know what you call it in Swedish. It's the traditional place of the burial and resurrection of Christ, al-Qiyamah in Arabic. And while he's in the church with the patriarch, the Christian patriarch of the city, Sophronius, the Muslim call to prayer sounds. It's 5 times a day. And so Sophronius, the Christian patriarch, says to Omar, why don't we pray here? Spread out your prayer carpet and pray here. And Omar says, no, absolutely not. I will not do that. Now, why would he not do that? Is it because a Christian church is unholy? No, very different. He says, look, if I were to pray in your church, my soldiers would see this, and they would feel that they had a right to pray in your church. And then you would lose control of your church. So I will not pray here. I'll take my prayer carpet, my prayer rug, and I'll pray out in front of the church. And they'll see that, and they'll understand that they have no right to take over your building. And so there's still a little mosque there called the Mosque of Omar, right in front of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's easy to miss. It's not very nice looking or anything like that. But historically, that's tremendously important, showing his respect for Christians, for non-Muslims, that he did not want to see their church taken over by his soldiers. And almost always, one of the things that Muslim treaties would do when they conquered cities would be to guarantee the safety of the churches and to buy an area for the building of a mosque. You can see the Grand Mosque of Cordoba, for example, in Spain. The Muslim Caliph of Spain bought that property. He didn't seize it from Christians. He bought it and built the mosque there. That's important to understand. That was the early attitude toward Christians. Now, there are negative things too. It's human. There are good stories and bad stories. But but the leading stories are good stories. There was another hand back here.
Could
Yes.
you just clarify when did he live?
Oh, I'm sorry, I should explain that. When did Muhammad live? Okay, Muhammad was born around 570 AD. Some people say 568. He died in 632 AD. And the most important year in the Muslim calendar, I should say something about this very quickly, is the year 622. Why? Because in that year, Muhammad leaves Mecca because he's being persecuted, and his followers are being persecuted. He leaves Mecca and he goes to the city of Medina, which actually wasn't called Medina yet, it was called Yathrib, but then it begins to be called Al-Medina, the city, or Medina to Nabi, the city of the Prophet. And so that's the second holiest city in the Islamic world. And his role changes from being just a prophet with a small following. He becomes the leader of a state, a government in Medina. And so the Quran is always divided into two parts, the Meccan revelations and the Medinan revelations, the ones that were received early and the ones that were received late. And the later ones are more political, more legislative, more legal. The early ones are mostly warnings about the end of time, repentance, the last judgment. The later ones, he's having to deal with issues like war, marriage, divorce, inheritance. And so that's where you get a lot of the Islamic law from. And that's where Islam takes on this political character that it has had ever since. Because Jesus never held political power, but Muhammad, for the last 10 years of his life, from 622 to 632, did. And so for Muslims, they look to him and say, well, how did he deal with things? What did he do? And that, that sets the standard then for Islamic refuge. Yes?
We accept Jesus Christ.
Yeah. The question is, why don't Muslims fully accept Jesus Christ as the Son of God? Well, because the Quran teaches that he never said he was the Son of God. They would say that the four Gospels got that wrong, that they misrepresent his teaching, that he was a prophet, and he preached the oneness of God, but he never claimed to be divine. And that, as I say, is the one absolute gulf, the big difference between Christianity and Islam. Because although Islam has a very high view of Jesus, it is not the Christian view. The Christian view, of course, sees him as the divine Son of God. So that's where we really do part company. So yes.
How much do we believe in the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament? Because here it's the prophecy that he will be divine.
Yeah. What about them believing the prophecies of the Old Testament? Most Muslims, as I say, probably don't read the Old Testament. They see the Quran as being the scripture that they should read. You might have a scholar that reads the Old Testament, but most wouldn't. They do call Jesus Al-Messiah, the Messiah, but they don't really make anything of the doctrine of, it's not a messianic doctrine like in Judaism or in Christianity, but he's known as two things, Kalamat Allah, the Word of God, and Al-Messiah, the Messiah. So he occupies a special place in Islam, but not divine, not quite up to the Christian level on that front. Yes?
Can you tell us something about the religion before, just before, or not?
Yeah, what was the religion in Arabia before Muhammad? It was pagan. It was not Christian. There were Christians in Arabia, there were some Jews. But most people in the Arabian Peninsula were neither Christian nor Jewish, they were pagans. They did, however, worship a god that they called Allah. And they knew about Allah before. They just they didn't have any clear notion of who he was. And that word Allah, by the way, is related to our word Elohim. And El. Al-Ilah is two words. It means the God. It's like capitalizing God. So they knew about God. So one of the striking things to me about the Quran is the Quran doesn't have to explain who Allah is. The Quran already assumes they know the name. They just have false ideas about him. So the Quran is saying, look, he doesn't have daughters. There is no one equal to him. There are not multiple gods. There's just one. But they already know him. They're familiar with the word. So there is, yes? Yeah, does the Quran say things to support discrimination against women, or is it just cultural? I'd say a lot of it's cultural. As I said earlier, I think a lot of it comes from the traditions that grew up in Islam after the close of the Quran. When the Quran says, for example, that women should veil their faces, it's talking particularly about the wives of the Prophet, not about women generally. And why are they told to veil their faces? I think it actually explains fairly clearly why. It's because there are people who are wanting to talk to Muhammad to get favors from him and so on. Well, he's busy and they usually are scared to approach him, so they were bothering his wives. So his wives are told, wear the veil, believers, leave them alone. And so it's the idea is to give these women some protection, but specifically the wives of the Prophet Muhammad. This is not necessarily a rule for all women. And I actually think that, I'll give you my Marxist interpretation of this. I'm not a Marxist, but I think economics has something to do with this. Certainly in the West now, it is very attractive. Women usually want to get a bit of a tan, a suntan. I don't know, Swedish women do, but American women do. Go to the beach, look a little darker, that sort of thing. Why do we do that? Well, it's because we want to show that we're people of leisure. We don't have to work, because our work today is often indoors. This shows you can get outside, you have time to catch a little sun and so on. In the 19th century, women didn't want to be dark. They didn't want to be tan. They wore gloves, carried parasols, covered themselves in every way. Why? Because most work was outside. And you wanted to show you were a woman of leisure. You didn't have to work out in the fields. You could afford to stay inside and not be suntanned all the time. The same thing was true, I think, for the veil. It's impossible to work in the fields wearing a veil, wearing all this garb and so on. So initially, veiling wasn't even a Muslim practice. It was the Byzantine Christians who veiled upper-class women. Those women wore veils and head coverings and all this sort of thing to show that they were women of leisure. It caught on in the Islamic countries from the Byzantines, but it caught on mostly among the upper class at first to show we don't work with our hands, we don't work out in the fields, that sort of thing. And then it becomes a general religious requirement, but I don't think it goes back to Muhammad at all. Now, there are some other rules that make differences between men and women, but by and large, women and men are treated more or less equally in the Quran. There are some distinctions, but I think a lot of the worst comes from the traditions that grow up later. And then another thing is that the men were the ones interpreting the law. I hate to say this about my own sex and gender, but you see the Quran giving clear rights of inheritance to women, and then the law actually begins moving away from that. Centuries after the Prophet Muhammad, they gradually eliminate the women's right to inherit, to control their own property, and so on. And this, I think, is simply what's happened so often before in human history, that men have worked against women using whatever tools they can use. So I see more hands than I have minutes, so I have to be careful here. Yes?
How is the church established or treated in the Muslim countries?
How is the church established or treated in the Muslim countries? We have some very good relations in the Muslim world. It varies from place to place. I know we have very good relations, for example, starting way off in Indonesia with the government there. I spent a day with an area authority 70 who was there in Indonesia, in Jakarta, by the name of Subandrio. He only has one name, by the way, Subandrio. It drives the American immigration authorities mad whenever he comes, because they want to know his first name. He doesn't have one. It's Subandrio. So he invented one finally to make them happy. But I went with him from government office to government office. He had access to cabinet ministers, officials at the highest level, because they were so impressed by the church's assistance during the tsunami crisis that we had very good relationships there. We entertained at BYU the man who a few months later became the president of Indonesia, Abdurrahman Wahid. That was a great experience. I could tell you more about that, but I don't have the time. But we have service couples, service representatives working in various areas, including northern Iraq today, doing humanitarian service there, in Syria. We have branches in Jordan and Lebanon, led by Arabs, by the way. There's one family in Beirut, for example, that converted in the United States, then went back to Lebanon, where they were from. And they've become the strength of the church, not only in Lebanon, but in other areas. Really remarkable people. We have branches in Cairo, and there's a Saudi Peninsula stake. So we have church representation there, and we're thought of highly in some areas. I can tell you stories about that. You don't think that they know about us, but they do. And in some places, they have really positive attitudes toward the church. I have a friend who went over there years ago. He's been practicing law in the Middle East for years now. But when he was first there, he was doing research, wanting to do research in the Saudi legal archives, and he couldn't get in. Finally, he got an invitation out of the blue from the Saudi Minister of Justice, who wanted to talk to him. And he said, "Now, you want to do research in our legal archives?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Are you a Mormon?" He said, "Yes, I am." "Why?" He said, "Well, that's all I need to know. Here, I'll sign it." Because he was a Mormon and he had a good attitude toward Mormons, he had had good experiences with them. That was all he needed to know. So we have representation there. We have service missionaries there. We've had legal status in Lebanon, or excuse me, in Jordan for quite some time. We have a Palestinian branch in just outside of Jerusalem in Bethlehem. So, and there are a number of Muslim converts. The Book of Mormon is being retranslated into Arabic. It hasn't yet been published in the new edition. The first edition, we had to hire a non-Mormon to do it. The second edition, this is a mark of how it's changed, is being done by a native speaker of Arabic, a returned missionary, former branch president, who's a professional linguist. So we didn't have that before, but now we do. So, yeah.
I want to bring us back to the current situation here in Europe. This may be impossible to answer, but seeing the flood of refugees coming in, generally Europe has had a very liberal, friendly feeling toward refugees coming in, trying to help them. That's not the case all over Europe, but how do you see the future? And should we be worried about it? Because even in the church, there are different ideas about this, that some feel it's good, some feel it's not good, and should we be worried? And how does the future look? What do you think? Yeah. Or what would you guess?
Yeah, the question is how to respond to the current refugee crisis in Europe. What do I see as the future? How should we deal with it? I wish I had a really clear answer to this, but it is a difficult question. As I say, many of these people are probably genuine refugees who really need help, and it's our Christian duty as Latter-day Saints, as just decent people, to step forward and try to help them. On the other hand, there are legitimate grounds to worry that the statistic I've heard is that Sweden accepted about 180,000 or 200,000 refugees last year. Is that right? A population of what, about 9 million?
163,000.
Okay, that's a huge number. That is a huge number relative to your population. As I say, in the United States, it would be 5 or 6 million people. And that can transform a culture. It can change whole cities. What's going to happen is these refugees will probably, if they settle, not settle out in the countryside. They'll tend to settle in urban areas, which makes their influence even more powerful in certain cities. And so it is something to worry about. How much, the Book of Mormon says it's not expedient that a man should run faster than he has strength. So even when we want to help, we have to be thoughtful about how we help. You may feel really impassioned about world poverty, but if you give away all of your own money, you just add one more poor person to the world, or one more poor family. So you have to think about these things, and so I don't have a clear answer to that. Are there grounds for worry? Yes, there are. Because again, if I were a leader of the Islamic State, ISIS, I know what I would be doing. I would be trying to put some of my people in among the refugees. And I'm positive they are. In fact, I've seen instructions from ISIS that even tells some of its people, wear crosses. Tell people you're Christians. How can they check? They can't know. And so you could even say, well, we'll accept only Christian refugees. Well, that doesn't mean you won't get some Islamic State people coming in as well. Should you be worried about that? Yes. Yes. That's something to worry about. It is dangerous, potentially. It won't threaten the existence of Sweden, but it could do damage. There could be terrorist attacks and so on. I hate to be alarmist, but I think we have to be realistic that there are people out there who do want to harm people in the West. And this is a wonderful way to smuggle people in among refugees so they get lost in the numbers. But even beyond that, it just is something always to worry about, that if you accept a large number suddenly of people whose culture is foreign, who don't speak your language, that can cause all sorts of problems down the line. If they come in large numbers of men, for example, without women, that's almost certainly going to cause trouble. And it has in places like Cologne, and I understand in Stockholm. I wish I could give a sunnier answer to that, but it is difficult. These are not easy things. And yet, we have that obligation to be kind and to be of service. And as was said in the most recent General Conference, Jesus and his own family were, in a sense, refugees. And how will we be judged? Savior says, if you've done it unto one of these, the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. And King Benjamin has a lot of words to say about refusing to help the beggar. So if we want to prove that we're Christians, that's one way we do it. So there's not an easy answer to this. We should help. We should help wisely. I don't know exactly what shape, what form that will take. You need to stop me fairly soon. I see other hands out here. In fact, you probably need to force a stop. Because I would just go on forever. I'm capable of that. So, well, maybe I better wind it down now. I just want to say that I try not to have an overly rosy view of the Islamic situation. Muslims are humans. There's a large number of Muslims. Some are very, very good. Most are very good people. They're ordinary people. They're people like your ordinary neighbors. If your neighbors were in trouble, you'd want to help them. But there are some bad ones among them. And unfortunately, this is in some ways a very unhealthy time in the Islamic world. Radicalism has gained a foothold. That's posed a lot of danger. By the way, it poses more danger to Muslims than it does to us. ISIS has killed far more Muslims than it has killed people in the West. Osama bin Laden's goal was to establish himself as caliph of the Islamic world. The West was a sideshow for him. They are killing people in the Middle East in many cases. And so we shouldn't feel singled out. But it's a difficult time. It's a difficult time for them. It's a difficult time for us to be Christians in a dangerous world. Yet the church is stepping forward and trying to help out with refugees in a big way. I know people have been sent. This is not an easy mission call. People have been sent, for example, to Kirkuk in northern Iraq to help out with refugees there. This is not a nice mission to Tahiti. This is a difficult place to work, but the church is sending people there. And they are, I won't say delighted, but they're happy to go and serve. And we need to be serviceable where we can. But again, thoughtful. Harmless as doves, but wise as serpents, right? That's the calling that we have. I bear in my testimony the church is true, and the church teaches that we have a Father in heaven who cares about all of us. We are all his children, including the non-Mormons, including the non-Christians, including the Muslims. We're all his children. He cares about us equally. And we ought to be going out there and trying to help out, because these are our brothers and sisters. And I bear you that testimony.